hear from policymakers in the Trump administration on the latest developments and how the United States will continue to engage on this issue. So I'm glad to welcome our panel, whom I'll introduce prior to their statements. And let me also welcome all our members, the public, and the press. And we're glad to have our friends from C-SPAN here this morning to cover our hearing. Before we start, without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Let me start by saying that the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela is simply heartbreaking. 90% of Venezuelans are living in poverty. More than 1 in 10 children suffers from malnutrition, and nearly 10% of the country's population of 31 million has fled overseas. What makes it even more heartbreaking is that this crisis is entirely man-made. Venezuela should be one of the wealthiest and most prosperous countries in the hemisphere it once was. But the corruption, incompetence, and mismanagement of Nicolas Maduro and Hugo Chavez before him have driven that country off the edge of a cliff. The blame lies squarely with the crooked officials who have repressed the Venezuelan people for years, doing everything from throwing political opponents in jail to rigging elections to gunning down protesters in the street. Now, some consider it a good soundbite to say that Venezuela represents the failure of socialism. But we should be honest that Venezuela is not a socialist country. It's a kleptocracy. It's a cruel and oppressive regime, pocketing every dollar it can, even if it means that the country's people are literally starving to death. Nowhere is Nicolas Maduro's disregard for his fellow Venezuelans clearer than his decision to block humanitarian aid from entering the country last week at the Colombia-Venezuela border. This was a disgrace, and we need to keep looking for ways to get this assistance to those who need it without provoking a confrontation that could lead to the loss of life. The Venezuelan people deserve better. They deserve the future they choose for themselves and their country. So our question is, how do we help them attain that future? How do we stand with the people of Venezuela as they seek a peaceful, democratic transition? First, governments around the world, and especially here in our neighborhood, need to support the Venezuelan National Assembly and Juan Guaido as they work toward free and fair elections, elections that must be monitored by credible international observers, including the OAS, the Organization of American States. The EU-Latin America Contact Group can play a potentially crucial role in laying the groundwork for these elections, an area where our own administration can provide financial and political support. What about U.S. policy more broadly? I will credit the administration. In the last few weeks, we've seen good multilateral engagement to grapple with this crisis. I'm glad the White House rejects Nicolas Maduro. I think we should reject authoritarians regardless of their ideology, and that would include despots like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. But I do worry about the President's saber-rattling, his hints that the U.S. military intervention remains an option. I want to make clear to our witnesses and to everyone else watching, U.S. military intervention is not an option. Congress decides when, where, and how the U.S. military is used around the world, and Congress would not support military intervention in Venezuela. Venezuela's neighbors feel the same way. Just last week, Colombia's Deputy Foreign Minister said that, and I quote him, "In no way would the Colombian government permit or agree with any type of military intervention," unquote, in Venezuela. With respect to new sanctions on the PDVSA, I appreciate the need to squeeze Maduro, but the White House must think through the potential repercussions that these sanctions could have on the Venezuelan people if Maduro does not leave office in the coming weeks. We need to continually evaluate their effectiveness. My biggest concern about the administration's policy is what appears to be missing. What are we going to do about the more than 3 million Venezuelans who have already left the country? This has become Latin America's biggest migration crisis in recent history, and I fear the United States may make things worse. For starters, we should be taking in more Venezuelan refugees, but our admission numbers are at their lowest in recent history. Worse, the immigration policies of the White House have resulted in more Venezuelans being deported back to Venezuela, and that's like sending people back into a burning building. The President could fix that with the stroke of a pen. he could grant temporary protected status, or TPS, to Venezuelans living in the United States. I hope he does so. And I've also co-sponsored a bill written by Representative Soto that would take this step. There's more we can do legislatively. Mr. McCall and I have spent the last 2 weeks trying to draft a bipartisan resolution on this matter. We were about 95% of the way there, but hit a roadblock similar to the Senate on how to deal with questions about the use of force in Venezuela. This is a policy difference, and it's a debate worth having, including during this hearing. We also have pending a few substantive bills introduced by Representatives Murkoslow-Powell, Shalala, and Wasserman-Schultz that would help alleviate the humanitarian crisis and dial up pressure on Maduro. I hope we're able to move them forward during our next markup. For now, I'm eager to hear from our witnesses to get a fuller picture of the administration's approach to this volatile situation. But first, let me yield to my friend, our ranking minority member, Mr. Michael McCall of Texas, for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When Nicolas Maduro was handpicked by Hugo Chavez